A widow in her 60s, living quietly on a worn-out Ohio farm, thought the rest of her life would be nothing but pension checks, doctor visits, and keeping up with her prescriptions. Then one stormy night, her late husband's old barn started to collapse, and from under a pile of cold, broken boards, she dragged out a shivering black kitten. 3 years later, that kitten weighs 200 pounds and knocked her clear off the hillside the very second the ground gave way, trading his body for her life. Now the neighbors are scared, the state is unsure, and a university is waiving money to take him away. Keeping this wild animal means living with real risk. Letting him go means cutting loose the strangest little family that ever saved her. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. On most mornings, the gravel road below Ellen Hart's farmhouse was quiet enough that you could hear the crows arguing in the cornfields. Today, though, every car that passed slowed down. Some drivers pretended they were just checking their phone reception. Others didn't bother to hide the way they craned their necks, eyes locked on the thing stretched across Ellen's lap. From the road it looked impossible. A 62-year-old widow in a faded flannel shirt, sitting in a rocking chair on a Buckeye State front porch, with what folks swore was a black panther draped over her legs like a house cat that had hit the wrong button on life. 200 pounds of sleek black muscle, head the size of a Thanksgiving turkey, chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. Every time it exhaled, Ellen felt the rumble deep in her bones. Shadow's tail flicked Juanantis, tapping her shin, and he let out a low, steady purr. Up close you could see the details the cell phone cameras never caught. The tiny white swirl of fur on his chest, the scar over one ear from the night the hill came down, the way his eyes softened whenever her hand found that spot under his jaw. To one side of her chair, Rusty, her old Australian shepherd, lay with his chin on the porch boards, one blue eye half open, making it very clear to anyone watching that this panther was his business too. Ellen could feel the weight of all three of them, Shadow, Rusty, and the letter sitting on the little side table by her coffee cup. The envelope was from the county, stamped with a seal she recognized from property tax notices and home insurance adjusters after spring storms. This one wasn't about a roof claim or flood damage. It was about Shadow. Review of safety concerns, it said, in that polite official language that never quite managed to hide the threat inside. A committee, a visit, a discussion about whether a 200-pound black kitten had any place on a small farm where school buses rumbled by every morning. She didn't need retirement planning brochures or reverse mortgage ads to tell her she was getting older. Her knees told her every time she stood up from that chair. Her Social Security check barely covered what does. Life insurance hadn't, and the hill behind the house still wore the raw scar from the night it tried to bury her. It would be so easy, she thought, to sell the place, move into a little condo near her daughter in Columbus, let someone else worry about property lines and liability. Shadow shifted in his sleep, one giant paw sliding down over her knee like a child claiming their place. His claws were sheathed, pads soft and warm against her. Ellen's hand moved without thinking, fingers slipping into the dense black fur at the back of his neck. He made that sound again, half purr, half sigh, and Rusty's tail thumped twice in approval. "Let them talk," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. A pickup rolled by slow enough that she could see the driver's mouth form the word crazy. She'd heard worse. 3 years ago, some of those same people had called her foolish for dragging a soaked bundle of bones out of a broken barn in the middle of a storm. Back then, Shadow had fit in the crook of her arm. Now he weighed more than she did. A breeze carried the smell of wet earth and hay up from the lower pasture. Somewhere down there, the barn creaked, the new one, not the old wreck that had almost killed them both. Ellen glanced at the scar on Shadow's ear and then at the envelope again. "They don't know," she said quietly, her voice rough but steady. "They weren't here the night I found you. They weren't here when you found me." Shadow's ear twitched at the sound of her voice. He didn't wake, but his tail curled tighter around her legs. Rusty gave a soft huff as if in agreement. From the road, it still just looked like some old woman and her monsters. Nobody passing by could see the broken barn in their memories, the rain that came sideways, the flashlight beam shaking in her hand, or the tiny, furious cry that had cut through the storm and changed everything. Ellen picked up the letter, folded it neatly in half, and tucked it beneath the saucer under her coffee cup. The committee could come. They could ask their questions and weigh their fears. Before they judged the giant on her porch, she thought, they ought to know the story of the black kitten she'd pulled from the dark 3 years ago, back when he was small enough to fit in a dish towel, and the only thing between him and the cold, wet night was an old woman who hadn't yet decided whether she wanted to keep living. She leaned her head back against the chair and closed her eyes, letting the sound of Shadow's purr pull her backward to the first time she heard it, faint and ragged, under the broken rafters of Tom's old barn. 3 years ago, she whispered, more to the wind than to anyone listening. It started with a storm. 3 years earlier, the farmhouse did not feel like a sanctuary. It felt like a museum someone had forgotten to close. Tom's boots still sat by the back door, one laced, one not, like he might come in from the pasture any minute. His jacket hung on the peg by the kitchen, stiff with old dust and hay. Ellen kept catching herself listening for his pickup in the drive, the way she had for 40 years. The sound never came. The doctors had called it a massive cardiac event. The funeral director had called it sudden. Ellen just called it unfair. She had left the hospital early, taken her pension, given up those long overnight shifts in the ER so she could spend more time with Tom on the farm. 2 months later, she was standing alone at the cemetery, wondering what to do with the rest of a life she hadn't planned on finishing by herself. During the day, she moved through the house like a ghost, dusting around his favorite mug, stepping over the loose floorboard on the stairs he'd always promised to fix. At night, she sat at the kitchen table with a pot of coffee and a stack of paperwork. Death certificates, Social Security forms, the life insurance check that felt both like a blessing and an insult. The bank manager talked to her about mortgage rates and refinancing options, about how she could tap into home equity if she wanted. Her daughter Amy called from Columbus and talked about condos near good hospitals, about Medicare supplements and better health insurance plans. It was Amy who finally said what Ellen had been circling for weeks. "Mom, you don't have to stay out there by yourself. Sell the farm. Come closer to me and the kids. Let someone else worry about snowplows and home insurance and wells freezing in February." The idea settled in her chest like a stone. She loved the land, but every fence post and pasture gate carried a memory of Tom's hands. Selling felt like betrayal. Staying felt like suffocation. One gray afternoon, she drove into town, met with a real estate agent, and signed the papers to list the place. The woman, all bright lipstick and sharp heels, assured her that rural properties close to the highway move fast, and that they'd find the right buyer in no time. But fast never came. The first couple who toured the farm loved the kitchen but hated the barn. They promised to call back. They never did. A man from out of state showed up, talked big about turning the fields into a hunting lodge, then backed out when he saw the estimate for repairing the old roof. The bank lost one set of documents and asked her to resend them. The contractor scheduled to patch the shingles after a spring storm simply didn't show, blaming another job and a mix-up. Little things kept going sideways. The home inspector found nothing major, but the report scared off another buyer anyway. A property tax bill came in higher than expected because someone at the county had miscalculated an assessment years ago. When Ellen called to sort it out, the clerk recognized Tom's name and ended up crying on the phone with her about how kind he always was at the feed store. It felt, in a strange, quiet way, like the farm itself was dragging its feet. At night, when she couldn't sleep, Ellen would sit with Rusty on the porch and listen to the wind push through the trees on the hill. She would picture herself in a small apartment outside Columbus, closer to Amy and the grandkids, with no fields to walk and no barns to repair. The practical part of her brain recited words like retirement planning and fixed income and property taxes. The part that still reached for Tom's side of the bed whispered, "You're not done here." One evening, as she stirred a pot of soup on the stove, the radio on the counter crackled to life with the local news. The announcer mentioned a traveling carnival passing through the next county over, complete with an exotic pet show, small tigers, unusual cats, even a black panther, folks. Ellen snorted softly. The last thing she needed was more animals to worry about. She turned the volume down and went back to her soup. Later, as she washed dishes, she noticed the sky outside the kitchen window had turned an ugly shade of greenish-gray. The air felt thick, the way it does before the worst storms. Rusty paced from door to door, whining under his breath. The weatherman cut into the regular broadcast with words she'd grown up hearing in Ohio but never quite gotten used to. Severe thunderstorm warning, rotation spotted, conditions right for possible tornadoes in rural areas. Ellen dried her hands, glanced once more at Tom's empty chair, and walked to the back door to secure the latch. Somewhere out beyond the yard lights, the old barn creaked on its tired foundation. She told herself she'd check it after the storm passed. She didn't know it yet, but before the night was over, that barn, and something small and black hiding inside it, would make sure she never left this farm the way she planned. The first thunder rolled in just after 8, a long, low growl that made the dishes in Ellen's cupboard tremble. The sky over the back fields had gone from gray to nearly black in what felt like minutes. Wind slapped the rain against the kitchen windows so hard she could see tiny bursts of mist every time a gust hit. Rusty paced from door to door, nails clicking on the old wood floor, whining under his breath. All right, she muttered, flipping the deadbolt on the back door and checking the latches on the windows like she'd done 100 times before. We've ridden out worse than this. The weather radio on the counter crackled to life, that harsh beep cutting through the rumble of the storm. A flat, urgent voice talked about rotation, about taking shelter in a basement or interior room, about getting away from windows. Ellen listened with half an ear as she pulled a flashlight from the junk drawer and set it on the table. Somewhere in her mind, she thought about people down the road already worrying about roof damage, about the home insurance claims and storm, repair crews that always seemed to follow a night like this. Then the wind changed. It stopped blowing in gusts and started pushing in one long, hard shove, as if some giant hand had leaned against the side of the house. The old place groaned. Rusty froze, ears up, eyes fixed on the back of the property where the dark outline of Tom's barn sat against the sky. A sharp crack split the noise of the rain, followed by a deep, splintering creak that made Ellen's stomach drop. That wasn't a tree. That was lumber giving up. She stepped onto the back porch and opened the screen door just enough to look out. Sheets of rain blurred everything, but she could see the barn's roofline was wrong. One corner of the metal had peeled back like the lid on a can, flapping wildly. Lightning flashed bright and white, and in that instant she saw it. One of the big roof beams had shifted, leaning at an angle it had never meant to lean. "Damn it, Tom," she whispered, an old habit whenever something on the property failed. "You always said you'd shore that up." The weatherman's voice bled through the crackle of the radio behind her. Reports of a tractor-trailer accident on County Route 12 near the old mill. Emergency services are on the scene. Possible overturned vehicle carrying animals from a traveling show. She barely heard it. Rusty barked, sharp and frantic, then bolted out into the yard before she could grab his collar. He ran straight toward the barn, fur flattened by the rain. For a second, Ellen thought about staying put, riding it out, letting the barn take whatever beating it was going to take. It wasn't worth risking a broken hip out there in the dark. Then she heard it. At first, she thought it was just a loose piece of tin banging in the wind. But under the howl of the storm, beneath Rusty's barking, there was another sound, a thin, desperate noise that cut right through her chest. It wasn't a dog. It wasn't a bird. It was high and ragged and furious, the way only something very small and very scared can sound. It came from the barn. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she breathed, snatching the flashlight off the table. She shrugged into Tom's old coat, the one that still smelled faintly of hay and motor oil, and yanked on her rubber boots. For half a heartbeat she thought of Amy's voice, of all those commercials she'd seen for accident attorneys and medical bills, and what could happen if you fell alone in a storm. Then she thought about that sound again. "Hang on," she said to nobody and to whoever was out there all at once. "Just hang on." The rain hit her like a wall as she stepped off the porch. Each breath felt like swallowing cold water. She kept the beam of the flashlight locked on Rusty's bobbing shape as he darted ahead, splashing through puddles. The ground squished and slid under her boots, the hill behind the barn looming like a dark wave. Up close, the barn looked worse. One section of the roof was peeled straight back, exposing the rafters like ribs. The big sliding door had jumped its track and hung crooked, leaving a gap just wide enough to let in rain. And something else. Rusty squeezed through first, and Ellen forced the door wider, slipping into the dim, wet gloom. The smell of damp hay and old wood hit her first. Then she heard it again, that broken, saw-blade cry coming from a heap of fallen boards and straw near the far wall. Her heart kicked hard. The beam of her flashlight shook as she raised it, catching the jagged edge of a broken rafter, the drip of water from the torn roof, the tremble of Rusty's tail as he crept forward, and then stopped, ears back. The pile of hay moved. Something black and shiny wriggled under the debris, one tiny paw scraping at the air. Another cry, weaker this time. Without thinking, Ellen dropped to her knees. The cold seeped through her jeans as she shoved at the loose boards, ignoring the way one nail snagged her palm. A plank shifted, then another, until at last she saw it clearly. It was small, much smaller than the sound it made. A soaked, shivering bundle of black fur, ribs showing through, eyes too big for its narrow face, stared up at her. Its ears were flattened, and its mouth was open in a soundless hiss before the next hoarse cry ripped free. "A kitten," she gasped, half to herself, half to Tom, half to the storm. "Somebody's poor little barn kitten." She slipped her hands under its body. The fur was icy, the bones frighteningly light. For a terrifying second, she felt nothing in its chest. Then a faint flutter, a fragile heartbeat against her fingers. "Got you," she whispered, cradling it against her soaked coat. "I've got you." The wind howled through the torn roof, and somewhere far off she thought she heard sirens heading toward that wreck on Route 12. But in that broken barn, in that one small circle of flashlight glow, there was only an old woman, an old dog, and a black kitten who had just been pulled out of the dark. By the time Ellen staggered back into the house, her arms were numb from cold and from holding the little body so close she was afraid she might crush it. Rusty barreled in ahead of her, shaking rain all over the linoleum. The storm still roared outside, but in the kitchen the light over the stove cast a small, steady circle of yellow that felt like the only safe place left in the world. She set the flashlight down, nudged the door shut with her hip, and laid the kitten on the kitchen table, on top of a folded dish towel. Up close, it looked even worse. Its fur pasted to its ribs, paws scraped raw, whiskers clumped with mud. Its chest rose and fell in short, uneven gasps. "All right, sweetheart," she murmured, voice slipping automatically into the tone she'd used with frightened patients in the ER. "This isn't my first night shift." She cranked up the thermostat, then grabbed another towel from the drawer. Soft old cotton, one of Tom's favorites with little blue stripes, and began to rub the kitten gently but firmly, trying to coax warmth back into its limbs. Rusty stood on his hind legs, front paws on the chair, nose inches away, eyes worried. "Back up, nurse," she told him. "You can supervise." The kitten let out a thin, broken sound that was more hiss than meow. It tried to bite once, a feeble snap that didn't even break the skin. Ellen almost laughed. "Good," she said. "If you're mad, you're still in there." She fetched a mixing bowl, filled it with hot tap water, and set a smaller bowl inside it like a makeshift warming bed. Layer after layer of towel went in until the kitten had a soft nest. She eased it down into the warmth, tucking the fabric around its sides the way she used to tuck blankets around Amy when croup had kept them up all night. Her mind ticked through the practical things: breathing, pulse, temperature. She slid 2 fingers to the kitten's chest. Still there, thready, but there. The little ribs rattled when it inhaled. Pneumonia, maybe. Broken ribs. She should have had oxygen, IV fluids, all the things they'd taken for granted at the hospital. Now it was just her, a battered kitten, and what she could improvise from a farm kitchen and an old first aid kit. She warmed a little evaporated milk on the stove, thinned it with water, and drew it into a syringe, her hands remembering the motion as if she'd never left the night shift. The first time she touched it to the kitten's lips, it turned its head away. The second time, its tongue flicked out, doubtful. By the third, it was swallowing in tiny jerks, eyes still half closed. "There you go," she whispered. "Room service. No copay, no health insurance required." Outside, thunder rolled again. The power flickered once, twice, then steadied. Ellen sent up a quick, wry prayer that if something had to go tonight, it would be a branch or a fence post, not the line feeding her old furnace. She didn't sleep. She sat at the table with Rusty at her feet and the kitten in its towel nest, watching its chest rise and fall. Every so often she'd reach over, lay her hand lightly on its side, feel the faint, stubborn beat under her palm. She thought about Tom, about how she'd sat by his hospital bed listening to monitors and experts talk about heart function and odds, and how none of that had changed the ending. Here, there were no monitors, no cardiologists, no talk of life insurance or long-term care. Just this one small life and whether it would decide to stay. Sometime near dawn, the rain softened. The roar of wind gave way to the steady drip of water from the eaves. Ellen realized her back ached and her eyes burned. The kitten had stopped shivering. It lay curled in a tight black coma, breath slower now, less ragged. Rusty lifted his head and gave a soft woof toward the window as a truck pulled into the drive. Headlights swept across the kitchen, cutting through the early gray. "Well," Ellen said, squinting at the clock, "if that's a car insurance adjuster at 6 in the morning, he's in for a surprise." It wasn't. A moment later there was a knock at the back door, 2 quick raps and then one slower, familiar from years of barn calls and late-night emergencies with colicky horses. Ellen opened it to find Dr. Mason on the porch, cap pulled low, jacket zipped up to his chin. "Storm woke me," he said, stepping inside and stomping the mud from his boots. "Figured if anybody's barn was going to lose a roof, it'd be yours." "Good morning to you, too," she said, but there was no real sting in it. "I did find something out there." She stepped aside so he could see the table. His eyes narrowed as he approached, glasses sliding down his nose. "Well, I'll be," he murmured. "Where'd you pick that up?" "Under a pile of lumber in the old barn," Ellen said. "Thought it was just a barn cat. Nearly froze to death." He pulled a stethoscope from his bag and listened with the easy efficiency of a man who'd spent his life working on everything from pigs to percherons. The kitten stirred, let out a faint growl that was deeper than Ellen expected. Mason frowned slightly. He lifted one of the tiny paws, gently extended the claws. Long, curved. Too big for something this size. His fingers ran along the spine, over the shoulders, feeling the muscle, the shape of the skull. "You find any others?" he asked quietly. "No," Ellen said. "Just him. Or her. I haven't checked." "Why?" He didn't answer right away. He straightened up, rubbing his chin. "Did you have the radio on last night?" "For a while." "There was a wreck on Route 12, tractor trailer from that carnival show. They were hauling some kind of exotic cats. Sheriff's office said a couple of crates busted open when the truck rolled." He looked back at the kitten. "Ellen, I don't think this is anybody's barn cat." The words hung in the warm kitchen air. The kitten opened its eyes, slits of pale green, and fixed them on Ellen's face, like it already knew that whatever it was, she was the one who'd pulled it out of the dark. By the end of that week, everybody on County Road 7 seemed to know Ellen Hart had something strange in her kitchen. It started with Helen Green marching up the drive in her quilted jacket, 2 neighbors trailing behind her like backup singers. Ellen saw them coming from the sink and felt her shoulders tighten. Rusty gave a low growl and took up position by the door. Helen didn't bother with hello. "Ellen, I hate to be the one to say it, but folks are worried. Last night my granddaughter swore she heard something screeching out here, and 2 of my hens are missing. You keeping some kind of wild critter in that house?" Ellen wiped her hands on a towel and stepped onto the porch. "I pulled a half-dead kitten out of my barn during the storm, Helen. That's all." "A kitten?" Helen sniffed. "Well, whatever it is, it doesn't sound like any barn cat I've ever had. This is a quiet road. People got grandkids. They don't want some circus animal getting loose." The words landed like little stones. Circus animal. Ellen thought of the overturned truck on Route 12, of Dr. Mason's careful hands and careful voice. She hadn't decided what to do with that information yet. She only knew that when she looked at the black bundle sleeping in Tom's old towel, she did not see a headline or a lawsuit. She saw something that had fought to stay alive. "I'm not letting anything run loose," she said evenly. "You all know how long I've lived here. I'm not about to turn the place into a zoo now." Helen's friends shifted, uncomfortable. One of them, Mark from the next farm over, cleared his throat. "County'll have to be notified, Ellen. If that's one of them exotic cats from the wreck, there's rules. Liability. My brother's in insurance. He says one bad bite. And your home insurance and health insurance both could get real complicated." Ellen almost laughed at the idea that a kitten barely bigger than Rusty's head was already a walking liability claim. But she saw the fear in their faces, fear of what might happen, fear of fines and lawyers and news vans in the driveway. "I'll talk to the right people," she said. "You have my word." They left grudgingly. As their truck pulled away, Rusty pressed against her leg. Inside, in the makeshift nest, the kitten, Shadow, she'd started calling him in her head, opened one eye, then went back to sleep. The right people showed up 2 days later in a state truck with a wildlife emblem on the door. The woman who stepped out was younger than Ellen expected, maybe early 40s, hair pulled back under a ball cap, brown jacket with state wildlife stitched over the pocket. She climbed the steps with the steady walk of someone used to bad news. "Ms. Hart, I'm Officer Rachel Park. Mind if I come in and have a look?" Ellen thought about saying no, but Rusty had already wagged once at the sound of the woman's calm voice, and lying wouldn't change the fact that rumors traveled faster than any pickup. In the kitchen, Rachel stopped just inside the doorway. Her eyes took in the towel nest, the heating pad, the bowls, the small dark shape curled in the middle of it all. Shadow shifted, lifted his head, and stared back at her. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Rachel exhaled. "Well," she said softly, "that is not a barn cat." She knelt, careful and slow, and studied him the way Mason had. Paws, claws, the length of his tail, the way his shoulders moved. Shadow gave a rumbling, kitten-sized growl. Rusty stepped between them, not threatening, just present. "I heard about the truck that overturned," Ellen said finally. "Mason thinks he came from there." "I'd say he's right," Tishel replied. "Looks like some kind of melanistic big cat. Hard to tell which species at this age, but whatever he is, the state considers him wildlife, not a pet." There it was, the line between saving something and owning it. "So what happens now?" Ellen asked, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "You take him? By the book?" Rachel nodded. "He'd go to a holding facility, then probably to a zoo or out-of-state sanctuary. But—" she looked again at the unlikely trio in front of her. Old dog, old woman, black kitten that refused to die. "He's imprinted on you and that dog. Moving him right now might kill him." Ellen swallowed. "Then don't." Rachel leaned back against the counter, thinking, "Ms. Hart, I have to protect the public. I also have to use common sense. Here's what I can do. I can recommend a temporary special permit. That gives you 30 days. 30 days for what? To prove you can keep him safely. Secure enclosure, training, emergency plan. I'll need vet reports, photos, maybe even an inspection from someone higher up. At the end of those 30 days, the state either grants a long-term permit or we remove him." The words dropped into the quiet kitchen like a gavel. 30 days. It sounded like a mortgage grace period, like the kind of deadline you hear in a bank commercial about refinancing before rates go up. Only this time, the thing on the line wasn't a loan. It was a life. Ellen looked at Shadow. He blinked slowly, then stretched one paw out until it touched Rusty's fur, as if to make sure his dog was still there. 30 days, she repeated, feeling something stubborn rise in her chest that had nothing to do with retirement plans or property values. "All right, Officer Park, then I guess we'd better get to work." The very next morning, Ellen pulled a yellow legal pad from the drawer and wrote 30 days across the top in block letters. Underneath, she started a list. Fencing, posts, heavy-gauge wire, concrete footers, locks, roofing, permits, vet checkups. Halfway down the page, she stopped and rubbed her eyes. The numbers she was penciling in looked like the kind you heard in mortgage refinance ads during the evening news, not something a widow on a fixed income should be tackling. She did it anyway. The man at the farm supply store blinked when she told him what she needed. "You building Fort Knox?" he joked, ringing up rolls of fencing that cost more than her last month's health insurance premium. "Something like that," she said, "just trying to stay ahead of my home insurance company." Back at the farm, she realized she couldn't lift half of what she'd bought. That problem solved itself when Caleb Miller, the 17-year-old from the next place down, wandered over after school. He'd grown up trailing behind Tom in the fields, asking a million questions about tractors and hay. "Need a hand, Miss Ellen?" he asked, eyeing the lumber stacked by the barn. She almost said no, not wanting to drag anyone else into this. Then Shadow padded up behind Rusty, still small enough to squeeze between the old dog's legs, but big enough now that his paws didn't look like they belonged on a house cat. Caleb's eyes went round. "Whoa! Is that?" "That," Ellen said, is the reason I'm about to blow a hole in my retirement planning." Caleb grinned. "Cool." With his help, the far corner of the property slowly turned into something between a pen and a prison. They dug post holes until Ellen's shoulders ached, mixed concrete in a wheelbarrow that had seen better days, hauled panels of chain link and heavier wire. They left enough room for Shadow to run, climb, stretch, but not enough for him to squeeze out. Rusty supervised every step, trotting the perimeter as if checking Ellen's math. At night, she'd collapse into her chair with aching hands and a stack of bills, wondering how many months her life insurance payout could stretch if she kept swiping her credit card like this. Then she'd feel the couch dip as Shadow climbed up, still more kitten than killer, and flopped half across her lap, purring like an idling truck. Rusty would wedge himself in wherever he could, as if afraid to miss the pile. Days blurred, Shadow's ribs filled out, his legs lengthened. The spots hidden in his dark coat faded a little. He wrestled with Rusty in the yard, never using his claws, letting the older dog pin him just often enough to keep Rusty's pride intact. If a car turned up the drive, Shadow would vanish behind Ellen's legs or into the shadow of the porch. Not bold or aggressive, just wary. By the time 30 days had come and gone, and Rachel came back for her first real inspection, the enclosure stood solid and silver in the sun, its gate festooned with enough locks to impress even the most nervous neighbor. Rachel walked the perimeter twice, pulled on each panel, checked the latches, took notes. Shadow watched her from inside, tail flicking, Rusty pressed against the mesh at his side. "He's growing fast," Rachel said. "How old is he now?" "Best guess, 5, 6 months," Ellen replied. "He eats like a teenage boy." Rachel smiled faintly, then turned serious. "The more he grows, the more important this gets. One incident, Ellen. One wrong move, and no special permit in the world will save him from being relocated." "I know," Ellen said. And she did. She'd seen enough accident attorney commercials to picture the billboards if anything went wrong. Wildcat Mall's neighbor. Call 1-800-SUE-SOMEONE. Summer came in earnest. The corn rose in neat green walls. Shadow's enclosure grass grew worn where he liked to run the fence line. On cooler evenings, Ellen would let him into the yard with Rusty while she sat on the back steps, coffee cup in hand, ready to call him back if anything felt off. It happened on one of those evenings. A young deer, thin and nervous, slipped in through a break in the hedgerow at the back of the field. It must have gotten separated from its mother. It stood there for a moment, sides heaving, ears twitching, before lowering its head to nibble at the clover near the fence. Shadow went still. 1 second he was rolling in the grass with Rusty's ear in his mouth. The next his body dropped into a low crouch Ellen had never seen before. Every line of him sharpened. His tail stiffened. His eyes locked onto the deer with a focus that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. "Shadow," she called, trying to sound calm. "Buddy, leave it." He didn't move. The air between predator and prey tightened. Ellen could see the muscles bunching under his dark coat, the way his paws spread for balance. This, she realized with a cold wash of fear, was what he had been born for. Not couches and food bowls and warm kitchens. This. If he went for that deer, if he killed it, it wouldn't just be a carcass in the grass. It would be proof to every nervous neighbor and every cautious official that he was exactly what they feared. Rusty saw it too. The old dog froze, then stepped in front of Shadow, planting himself between cat and deer. His hackles rose, but not toward the deer. He turned his head, stared right into Shadow's eyes, and gave a sharp, commanding bark that Ellen had only ever heard him use on cattle headed for the wrong gate. "No," it said, as clearly as any word. For a few long seconds, nothing moved. The deer lifted its head, ears flicking. Sensing danger, It couldn't quite place. Shadow's muscles quivered. His lips pulled back just enough to show the tips of white teeth. Ellen felt her heart hammering so hard she thought she might have to check her own pulse. Then something in his expression shifted. The hard, bright edge in his eyes softened. His tail flicked once, then dropped. He blinked, looked past the deer as if seeing it for the first time, and turned away. A moment later he flopped onto his side in the dirt, rolled over, and presented his belly to Rusty like a clown at the end of a show. Rusty huffed, then pounced, grabbing Shadow's scruff in his mouth in their familiar game. The deer, bewildered but alive, bounded back through the hedge and disappeared into the trees. Ellen realized she'd been holding her breath. She let it out in a shaky laugh that turned into a sob halfway through. She sat down hard on the step, hands over her face for a moment, then reached for the phone on her hip. When she told Rachel about it the next day, the officer listened without interrupting. Later, when she stopped by, she stood quietly at the fence, watching Shadow and Rusty nap in a heap. "Most folks think instinct is everything," Rachel said at last, "but sometimes what you choose matters more. Keep telling that story, Ellen. The day may come when you need every piece of proof you can get that this animal chose his family over, his nature." Ellen looked at the two of them, dog and not quite cat, breathing in sync in the afternoon sun. For the first time since Tom died, she felt something like pride loosen the cold knot inside her. He'd chosen them. Now it was her turn to keep choosing him. The summer the hill came down, the rain didn't fall so much as settle in. Day after day, gray clouds hung over the fields, dripping steadily. The ground around the barn turned to soup. The little creek that usually whispered along the back property line swelled and pressed hard against its banks, brown and impatient. Ellen kept an eye on the slope behind the house. Tom had talked years ago about terracing it, maybe putting in a retaining wall. Like a lot of things, they'd never quite gotten around to it. Now the grass there stayed soggy, tire tracks from Caleb's truck filling with water and refusing to drain. On the radio, between country songs and ads for Medicare plans and mortgage rates, the announcer mentioned saturated soil and localized flooding. There was a segment about when to call your home insurance company and what counted as flood damage. Ellen shook her head and turned it down. You could insure a roof or a pickup, maybe even your income, if you paid for the right life insurance. But there were some things no policy could put back once they were gone. That evening the rain picked up again, harder this time, a straight curtain falling out of a sky the color of wet concrete. Ellen did her usual rounds anyway, pulling on her old raincoat and checking locks, gates, fences. Shadow padded along inside his enclosure, Rusty glued to his side as always. Lightning flickered far off, rumbling a few beats later. "Storm's moving in," she told them. "Y'all be glad you're not out there on the road." Back inside, she made tea, called Amy to say she was fine, and tried not to listen too closely to the weather alerts on her phone. A landslide warning popped up with a shrill tone. She acknowledged it and set the phone face down. She'd grown up with plenty of warnings that never turned into anything. The hill had held this long. Around midnight the sound changed. The steady drumming on the roof deepened into something heavier, like buckets being dumped from the sky. The old house creaked. Rusty, who usually snored through anything, started pacing at the foot of her bed. Shadow, confined for the night in his enclosure off the back of the house, let out a low, continuous rumble that didn't sound like his usual complaint. Ellen sat up, heart ticking faster. "What is it, boy?" Rusty trotted to the back door, nails scrabbling, then ran back, whining. Shadow's growl climbed into a full-throated roar that made the window glass tremble. "All right," she muttered, slipping her feet into boots. "I'm coming. Hold your horses." When she opened the back door, the wall of sound hit her. Rain, wind, The roar of the swollen creek, the yard. Lights turned everything a sickly yellow. Mud sucked at her boots as she splashed toward the enclosure. Shadow was at the fence, muscles coiled so tight his whole body shook, eyes not on her but on the slope behind the house. "Shadow?" she called. "Hey, it's okay." She heard it then. Not thunder, not wind. A deep groaning crack from inside the earth itself, followed by a strange, sliding hiss. The kind of sound you feel in your bones before your brain catches up. The hill was moving. She turned, flashlight beam jerking over the grass, and saw the ground at the base of the slope bulge, then slump like a rug being pulled. A tree that had stood behind the house longer than she had lived there tipped forward in slow, awful grace. "Ellen!" someone shouted from the darkness. Caleb's voice, thin over the storm. Her phone had clearly woken him with the same alert. "Get away from the house!" She took one step toward the porch without really deciding to, and that was when the world jumped. The mud under her feet lurched. She flailed, arms windmilling. Somewhere to her right, the earth tore open with a noise like ripping cloth. The big tree came down, roots screaming out of the hill. For a fraction of a second she understood in a terrible, clear way that if she stayed where she was going to die right here, between her kitchen and Shadow's pen. She never hit the ground. Something slammed into her side, hard enough to knock the breath out of her. It wasn't mud. It wasn't a branch. It was warm and solid and moving on purpose. Shadow's weight crashed into her hip and shoulder, shoving her sideways, sending her rolling across the slick yard like a tossed doll. The tree slammed down exactly where she'd been standing. The porch steps splintered. A section of foundation crumbled with a sound that would haunt her later. The hill slid, a tongue of mud and rock and roots burying the space between house and enclosure. When everything finally stopped, the quiet was almost worse than the noise had been. Rain still fell, but the groan of moving earth was gone. Ellen lay on her back, staring up at the dark, feeling her heart pounding against her ribs. Her side hurt. Her hands were scraped. She wiggled her toes, her fingers. Everything still worked. A rough, wet nose nudged her cheek. Rusty whined, licking at her, until she managed to lift an arm and grab his collar. "I'm all right," she croaked. A second shadow loomed above her. Shadow's massive head lowered, his whiskers brushing her chin. He chuffed once, hot breath in her face, and then did something she would have sworn a wildcat could not do. He lay down, full weight pressed against her side, as if to pin her to the solid ground that was left. Over his shoulder, in the flicker of the security light that still clung to life, she could see the mess they'd narrowly avoided. The place she had been standing a heartbeat earlier was now under a tangle of bay. Roots and mud and broken lumber from the porch. The fence of his enclosure bowed but held, half buried on one side. The hill wore a raw, oozing scar. Caleb appeared out of the dark, soaked through, phone in his hand, camera already rolling without him thinking about it. "Oh, my God," he gasped. "Miss Ellen, are you okay? I saw the alert and then I thought—" "I'm here," she said, one hand tangled in Rusty's fur, the other resting on Shadow's wet shoulder. Her voice shook, but it worked. "Thanks to him, I'm here." There would be time later for insurance adjusters and contractors, and maybe even an accident lawyer if someone decided the county should have done more about drainage. There would be time for Rachel to come out and shake her head in disbelief, for news vans and questions and all the things that follow a miracle caught on camera. Right then, under the pounding rain and the flickering yard light, there was only this. An old woman who had once pulled a black kitten from a broken barn, lying in the mud between a loyal dog and the not-so-little wild thing that had just knocked her out of the path of the grave. In the weeks after the landslide, the farm looked like a war story. The back steps were gone, the foundation cracked, and a brown scar cut down the hill where the earth had slid. For a while it was just Ellen, a handful of contractors, and more paperwork than she'd ever seen outside a hospital chart. The home insurance man came, shook his head at the damage, and took pictures from every angle. Neighbors drove by slow, pretending they weren't staring. What none of them knew at first was that the real story had already left the driveway. Caleb's shaky, rain-soaked video, all heavy breathing, and shouted, "Miss Ellen?" and one clear shot of Shadow slamming into her just before the hill broke loose, hit the internet before dawn. By lunchtime, the local station had called. By the next morning, a national morning show wanted an interview with the Ohio widow saved by her wild cat. Ellen joked to Rachel that her little landline phone wasn't built for this much attention. When the TV crew arrived, Shadow stayed behind the fence at first, pacing, eyes wary of the big cameras and the tangle of cords. Rusty trotted right up to everyone like he'd been born on a movie set. The reporter stood in the yard, hair sprayed stiff against the breeze, and asked Ellen what had happened that night. "He knocked me clean out of the way," Ellen said, looking into the lens as if she were talking to a single friend. "If he hadn't, I'd be buried under that mess. Folks talk about life insurance and retirement planning and all the ways you can prepare for the worst. I never once thought, get yourself a 200-pound cat would be on that list." The line made the cameraman chuckle. Later, when the segment aired, it made half the country laugh, and then go quiet as they watched the replay of Shadow's body slamming into hers in slow motion, mud and roots and tree crashing down exactly where she'd been standing. Fame brought more than cameras. It brought opinions. Some people mailed cards and prayers. Others sent angry letters about public safety and dangerous animals. A man from out of state wrote offering to solve the problem for a fee, which Ellen threw straight into the trash. Through it all, Shadow stayed what he had always been, watchful, close, pressed up against Rusty at every chance. About a month after the slide, a university SUV pulled into the drive. The woman who stepped out wore hiking boots with her blazer, a clipboard under one arm. "Mrs. Hart, are you? I'm Dr. Lydia Scott from the Behavioral Sciences Department at Ohio State. We've been following your story." Ellen poured coffee at the kitchen table while Lydia laid out glossy photos and charts. She talked about research funding, about how little anyone really understood interspecies bonding, about how rare it was to see a human, a domestic dog, and a large wild cat knit together like this. She talked about liability and safety, too, about how a university facility could offer things Ellen never could. Reinforced enclosures, full-time staff, veterinary teams with health insurance and state-of-the-art equipment. "We'd build a habitat just for him," Lydia said gently. "He'd have space, enrichment, constant monitoring. You'd have full visiting privileges, of course. And we'd pay you a stipend for serving as his primary historical source. It could help with the house repairs, your medical bills, even Medicare gaps." Amy, who had driven down from Columbus for the meeting, sat at the end of the table, hands wrapped around her mug. "Mom," she said carefully, "this could mean you don't have to worry so much. About money. About what happens if you get sick. You're not getting any younger." Ellen looked from her daughter to the paperwork. The numbers on Lydia's offer might as well have been written in another language. They were the kind she heard in ads about mortgage rates and credit cards, sums she'd never thought would have anything to do with her little farm. For someone else, it would have been a golden ticket. Sell the story, secure the future, let the experts handle the wild animal in the yard. That night, long after Lydia had gone back to her hotel and Amy had fallen asleep on the couch, Ellen walked into the kitchen for a glass of water. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and Rusty's soft snore. In the corner, on the same old braided rug where she'd first set that shivering bundle down 3 years earlier, Shadow lay, curled in a crescent of black. He barely fit now. His shoulders spilled onto the tile, his tail wrapped all the way around Rusty's sleeping body. Under one heavy paw, she saw it. The frayed edge of Tom's blue-striped dish towel dug out of some drawer and dragged there who knows when. Shadow's head rested on it like a pillow. For a long time Ellen just stood there, watching the rise and fall of two chests, one gray and speckled, one deep and black. 3 years. From a black kitten the size of her hand to this. She thought about the barn and the hill and the crack of breaking earth. She thought about all the neat little boxes on Lydia's chart, on every health insurance form she'd ever filled out. Smoker, non-smoker, married, widowed, pet owner or not. Nothing there had ever asked, who would shove you out of the way when the world gave out under your feet? The next morning, Lydia and Rachel sat side by side at the kitchen table, waiting for her answer. Amy sat across from them, eyes red from a night of her own worrying. Ellen set down 3 cups of coffee, then a small ceramic bowl on the table. Inside was Tom's old pocket knife. She flipped it open, revealing the tiny hash marks she'd once watched him carve into the porch post as the years of their marriage ticked by. "I've spent a lot of time listening to people in suits tell me what's best for me," she said quietly. "Bankers, doctors, lawyers, folks selling health insurance on TV. And I'm sure that on paper what you're offering is smart, safer, easier." She looked toward the back door where Shadow's silhouette moved behind the frosted glass. "But that animal out there pulled me out of my grave. I don't think he did it so he could spend the rest of his life behind glass walls being measured. He chose this porch, this dog, this crazy old woman who thought she was done with surprises." Lydia's face softened. "Are you saying no?" "I'm saying," Ellen replied, "that if he wanted a bigger life, he's had 3 years to jump the fence. He keeps coming back to my doorstep, so I'm going to keep choosing him back. If the state wants to shut us down, they'll have to look me in the eye and say it." Rachel blew out a slow breath, something like relief in it. "Then maybe we don't shut you down," she said. "Maybe we help you tighten things up. Educational signage, scheduled visits, stricter rules, an official designation as a small sanctuary. It won't make your mortgage payment, but it might buy you peace with the county." And that was how, months later, a hand-painted wooden sign went up at the end of the gravel drive. Shadow's Haven, Educational Sanctuary. Kids came on Saturdays with school groups, wide-eyed, listening to Ellen tell the story of the storm and the barn and the night the hill moved. Caleb, now in community college studying wildlife biology, acted as tour guide, grinning as he pointed out Rusty's assistant manager role. On the anniversary of the landslide, Dr. Mason came by with his scale and his calm old hands. Shadow stepped up, more out of habit than training. The needle swung, then settled. "Well, Miss Ellen," Mason said, pushing his glasses up, 3 years ago you brought me a half-frozen scrap that barely hit 2 pounds. Today he's right at 200. Ellen laughed, the sound rich and full, surprising even herself. She laid her palm on Shadow's back, feeling the solid, living weight there. "I saved a black kitten from my barn," she said. 3 years later, he hit 200 pounds. And somehow I'm the one who ended up insured against the worst night of my life." Shadow leaned into her hand, purring so deep it seemed to come up from the earth itself. Rusty bumped her knee, demanding his share of the moment. The hill behind the house was scarred but stable. The house was patched. The future wasn't guaranteed. No credit card, no policy, no plan ever could do that. But for the first time since Tom had slipped away in a hospital bed, Ellen felt something like safety. Not the kind you sign for at a bank or compare quotes for online. The kind that shows up on 4 paws in the dark, knocks you out of harm's way, and then curls up at your feet when the cameras are gone. She sat down on the porch, Shadow's massive head in her lap, Rusty pressed against her side and watched the road below. Cars still slowed, still stared. Let them, she thought. Let them wonder. If they asked, she'd tell them the truth. She had gone out into a storm to save a black kitten, and 3 years later, that kitten was the reason she was still here to tell the tale. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Before you scroll away, tell me this. Do you believe a bond like theirs could really exist? If this story touched your heart, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might just remind you that sometimes the wild loves us back in ways we'll never forget.